It was a warm spring afternoon when I first received the letter. I had just spent hours outside, carefully tending to my garden, when I saw the official-looking envelope resting on my doorstep. At first glance, I thought it was another one of those unsolicited offers, maybe some company trying to sell me overpriced lawn care services. But something about the thick, formal-looking letter made me hesitate. It wasn't from a company. It was from the Homeowners Association, HOA. I tore it open with a mix of curiosity and dread, already knowing that whatever was inside wouldn't be good. The letter was a violation notice, informing me that my beloved statue, the one I had carefully placed in the front yard for over 3 years, was offensive and had to be removed. I blinked, rereading the words on the page. Offensive? How could a beautiful statue, elegantly carved, standing proudly under the oak tree, possibly be deemed offensive? The words violation and non-compliance stood out in bold letters, followed by threats of fines if the statue wasn't removed. My heart raced as I tried to process the absurdity of it all. I had lived in this neighborhood for over a decade, and in all that time, I had never been in trouble with the HOA. I was a quiet, responsible homeowner, rarely causing a fuss, always following the rules. So why now? What had changed? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the statue, which had never been a problem before, was the only thing I had ever done to challenge the sterile uniformity the HOA insisted on enforcing. This statue had been my little rebellion, my statement of individuality in a place that often felt like a world of beige walls and cookie-cutter homes. But now, it seemed like my peaceful protest was under attack. With a deep sigh, I looked out at the statue from my window. It stood there as it always had, a symbol of strength and creativity in the midst of a neighborhood that prized conformity above all else. But now, it was labeled as offensive. Who decided what was offensive? And why had it become an issue now? My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car driving slowly past my house, followed by a sharp glance from a neighbor who had never once looked my way in the past. It felt like something was brewing, like the storm was gathering. I knew that I couldn't let this go without a fight, but I had no idea what kind of battle I was about to be drawn into. As I sat there, staring at the letter in my hands, the weight of what it represented settled heavily on my shoulders. I had always known that living in a neighborhood governed by an HOA meant following a set of rigid rules, but this felt different. This wasn't about lawn care or maintaining the color of my mailbox. This was personal. This was about my right to express myself in a space I owned, to add something that reflected who I was amidst a sea of houses that all looked the same. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the HOA had been quietly infringing on my sense of autonomy for years. Every little restriction felt like a jab at my individuality, a push to conform to their idea of what the neighborhood should look like. But the statue? It was a step too far. I knew I couldn't back down, not now. But where would this lead? Was I really going to find myself in an all-out war with the HOA over something as trivial as a statue? I could already feel the tension mounting as I walked outside to examine the statue once more. It was a beautiful piece, a hand-carved stone figure of a woman with outstretched arms, symbolizing freedom and expression. When I had first placed it in my front yard, I had no idea it would spark such controversy. I had bought it from a local artist, a small gesture of support for the community, and it had become a fixture in my yard, one that I had grown attached to over the years. The statue didn't just sit there. It became a part of my routine. Every morning, I would pass by it on my way to work, its serene presence providing a moment of calm before the rush of the day. It was a reminder of my decision to live outside the constraints of the city, to break free from the sterile, impersonal environments I had grown so weary of. But now, it felt like that very symbol of freedom was being ripped away from me. Who had decided it was offensive? I hadn't heard any complaints from neighbors. In fact, many of them had complimented the statue, saying it added character to the otherwise uniform block. I couldn't understand how something so innocuous had become a point of contention. As I mulled over this, I noticed a few of my neighbors walking by, their heads turned slightly toward my yard, their eyes darting toward the statue before quickly looking away. I hadn't noticed this before, but now it felt as if everyone was watching me, waiting to see how I would respond. The sense of isolation was palpable. I couldn't help but wonder if this was more than just the HOA making a fuss over an art piece. Was there something deeper at play? Had I unknowingly stepped into a larger battle for control over the neighborhood? That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to relax, but every time I closed my eyes, I could see the image of the statue in my mind, standing tall and defiant, yet somehow vulnerable, as if waiting for the inevitable storm to arrive. My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into a driveway next door. I looked out the window, half expecting to see another member of the HOA walking past my property with a clipboard. But it wasn't just anyone. It was the HOA president, Natalie. She had been a fixture of the community for years, always trying to enforce rules with a sharp, no-nonsense attitude. I had never had any personal issues with her, but I had heard whispers of her increasing authoritarian stance in recent months. She was the kind of person who thrived on control, always making sure that every detail of the neighborhood adhered to her idea of perfection. The next morning, I couldn't help but notice how much quieter the neighborhood seemed. Normally, there was a low hum of activity as people went about their routines, but today, everything felt unnervingly still. I glanced over at the statue again, a sinking feeling settling in my stomach. The HOA had sent me a clear message. Either I comply, or I face the consequences. But what could I do? I didn't want to engage in a long, drawn-out fight, but the thought of removing the statue, of giving in to this arbitrary demand, was unbearable. I felt like I was being backed into a corner, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the issue was bigger than just one statue. It was about standing up for my right to make my own decisions about the space I owned. It was about not allowing someone, anyone, to dictate what I could or couldn't do with my property. That afternoon, I decided to take action. I went to the local library and spent hours researching HOA regulations, property rights, and legal precedents. I needed to understand exactly what my options were, because I wasn't about to let them intimidate me into submission. Armed with a stack of legal documents and a growing sense of determination, I began drafting a letter of my own. I wasn't going to just accept the violation notice and remove the statue. If the HOA wanted to play this game, I was going to be ready to fight back. But the more I wrote, the more I realized that this wasn't just about the statue. It was about asserting my independence, about reminding myself that I had the power to decide what happened on my property. This was my home, my sanctuary, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me. As I sealed the envelope and prepared to send it off, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The HOA had made their move, but I had my response ready. What they didn't know was that I wasn't afraid of a fight. In fact, I was just getting started. The days following my letter to the HOA passed in a haze of anxious anticipation. I spent most of my time nervously watching for the next move from the organization, wondering if they would escalate things further or simply back off. I had hoped that my carefully worded response would be enough to send a message, to make them realize that I wasn't the kind of person to be bullied into submission. But deep down, I knew this wasn't going to be easy. People like Natalie, people who thrive on controlling every aspect of their surroundings, don't back down easily. And sure enough, just as I had feared, it didn't take long for the HOA to respond. One afternoon, as I was trimming the hedges in my front yard, I saw a black SUV slowly roll past my driveway. It was unmistakably a member of the HOA, and I felt a jolt of dread shoot through me. I stood frozen for a moment, watching as the car stopped a few houses down, and then a familiar figure emerged. It was Natalie, her heels clicking on the pavement as she approached my property. She didn't stop at the mailbox or even try to make small talk. She headed straight for the statue, her eyes locked on it with a mixture of distaste and determination. I took a deep breath and prepared myself for what was about to come. Natalie didn't even look in my direction as she approached the statue. Instead, she simply stood in front of it, hands on her hips, her gaze sweeping across it as if she were inspecting an item that had failed to meet her exacting standards. I could feel my pulse quicken. It was clear that she wasn't here to resolve the issue amicably. This was a confrontation, and I had to be ready. But how could I prepare for a confrontation that felt so unjust? My property, my space, and my rights were under attack by an organization that seemed to have no interest in anything but conformity. For a brief moment, I almost considered backing down, taking the statue inside, and avoiding the hassle. But then I remembered the reason I had placed it there in the first place: to stand as a testament to my desire to break free from the constraints of a world that insisted on telling me how to live. I couldn't let them win, not over something as insignificant as a statue. As I stood on my porch, silently watching Natalie, I realized that this wasn't just about the statue anymore. It had become about something much larger, about the power of the HOA, about the right of homeowners to make their own choices, and about whether I would allow myself to be dominated by a group that didn't even have legal grounds to control me. Natalie was still standing there, arms crossed, inspecting the statue as though it were some kind of dangerous contraband. I knew she was gathering her ammunition, preparing to hit me with some legal threat that would force my hand. But I wasn't going to give in that easily. I had already consulted with a lawyer, and I knew my rights. I wasn't breaking any laws. The statue was not an eyesore. It was not a hazard. It was simply a piece of art that had become an integral part of my home. But to the HOA, it was a symbol of resistance, a challenge to their authority, and that was something they couldn't abide. I watched as Natalie took out her phone and began making a call, her fingers tapping rapidly on the screen. She was undoubtedly gathering more support for her cause, maybe even plotting how to push me further into submission. I felt a flicker of anger rise within me, but I tamped it down. Now was not the time for rash decisions. I needed to stay calm, stay composed, and think this through. Whatever was coming next, I had to be prepared. After a few minutes, Natalie hung up and turned to leave, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement as she marched back toward her car. I stood there, still staring at the statue, feeling the weight of the situation settle deeper into my chest. This was only the beginning. I knew that the HOA wasn't going to back down, and neither was I. But as I stood there in the quiet of my front yard, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to escalate. Over the next few days, I kept a close eye on the mailbox, half expecting another letter, maybe even a warning. But instead of a piece of mail, I was greeted by something far more unsettling. One morning, as I was heading out to my car, I noticed a car parked across the street, its engine running but its driver sitting still, staring at my house. I paused, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The car was a nondescript sedan, not one I recognized from the neighborhood. But it was the driver who caught my attention, his face hidden behind dark sunglasses, his posture rigid and watchful. I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine. It was as if I were being watched, stalked even, by someone with a vested interest in my every move. I stood frozen for a moment, wondering if I was just being paranoid. But then the car slowly drove away, its tires humming on the pavement. My heart was racing now. This wasn't just some random passerby. This was someone sent to keep an eye on me, to see if I would make a move. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. Different cars, different drivers, but always the same watchful gaze, always the same sense of unease. It was clear that the HOA had escalated their tactics. They weren't content with just sending letters. They were trying to intimidate me, trying to make me feel like I was being constantly surveilled, like every step I took was being monitored. The worst part? It was working. I felt myself becoming paranoid, jumping at every car that drove past, glancing over my shoulder every time I stepped outside. It wasn't just the statue anymore. It was my entire sense of security that was under siege. And I knew that if I didn't do something soon, the HOA's tactics would break me. But what could I do? How could I fight back when they seemed to have every resource at their disposal? I spent hours researching my legal options, looking for any loophole, any angle I could use to fight back. I didn't want to back down, but I couldn't keep living like this, constantly watching my back, feeling like a prisoner in my own home. It wasn't just the statue anymore. It was my life, my freedom, and I wasn't going to let the HOA take that away from me. The days dragged on, each one heavier than the last. It felt like I was living in a constant state of tension, always waiting for the next move, the next confrontation. The HOA had made their intentions clear, and they weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted, my compliance. But I wasn't about to give in. I had already fought too hard to let this petty, intrusive organization dictate the terms of my life. The surveillance continued. Cars parked across the street, people I didn't recognize walking past my house, their eyes furtively glancing at my front yard. It was like being under a microscope, every move scrutinized. But no matter how many cars they sent or how many eyes they had on me, I was not backing down. I spent my days researching the law, contacting legal experts, trying to figure out the best way to take a stand. It became clear that I wasn't dealing with an organization that would be easily intimidated, but I was learning, piece by piece, how to navigate the legal minefield they had created. One evening, as I sat at my kitchen table reviewing my legal options, the phone rang. It was my lawyer, a woman named Lisa Carter, who had been helping me navigate this battle from the beginning. Her voice was steady and reassuring as she explained the next steps we were going to take. "We need to escalate this," she said. "The HOA is testing the waters, and if they think you'll cave under pressure, they'll keep pushing. But if we stand firm, they'll eventually have to back down." I agreed with her, though part of me still felt like a pawn in this larger game. What was it about the statue that had struck such a nerve with them? It wasn't like I was asking for anything unreasonable. All I wanted was the freedom to express myself in my own yard, to make a small statement of individuality in an otherwise monotonous world. Yet here I was, embroiled in a battle that seemed to be about so much more than just a piece of art. The next day, Lisa drafted a letter to the HOA, outlining my legal rights and demanding that they cease all attempts to force me to remove the statue. We weren't just responding to their threats anymore. We were pushing back. The letter was firm, clear, and, most importantly, backed by legal precedent. The HOA had no right to demand the removal of a non-offensive piece of art from a private property that was not under their jurisdiction. They had crossed a line, and now they were going to face the consequences of their actions. As I read through the letter, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was taking control of the situation. I wasn't just reacting to their demands. I was fighting back. The letter was sent off that afternoon, and now it was in the hands of the HOA. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I also knew that I wasn't alone in this fight. Lisa was with me every step of the way, helping me navigate the legal complexities and offering advice on how to protect my rights. But even with the letter sent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing beneath the surface. The HOA wasn't just going to roll over. They had made their stance clear, and they weren't the type to back down without a fight. As the days passed, I began to notice more subtle signs of their growing aggression. Neighbors who had once greeted me with friendly waves now avoided eye contact, turning their heads when they saw me walking outside. It wasn't that they were actively hostile, but it was clear that the HOA's influence was starting to seep into the community. People were afraid. They had been conditioned to fear the HOA's power, to fall in line with their demands, no matter how unreasonable. It was starting to feel like I was standing alone against an entire neighborhood, and the weight of that isolation was starting to wear on me. I began to question my decision to fight back. What if it wasn't worth it? What if the hassle of dealing with the HOA was more trouble than it was worth? The doubt crept in like a shadow, clouding my thoughts, but I quickly pushed it aside. I had already come this far. I wasn't going to let the HOA's petty tactics defeat me now. If anything, this only fueled my resolve. I was determined to show them that they couldn't bully me into submission. I wasn't going to be one of those people who simply gave in to the pressure. If they wanted a fight, they were going to get one. In the days that followed, the tension between me and the HOA grew even more palpable. One morning, I woke up to find a letter from the HOA waiting for me on my doorstep. My stomach sank as I read through it. The language was even more aggressive than before, filled with threats of escalating fines and legal action. They accused me of ignoring their previous notices, of failing to comply with their demands. But what really got to me was the final line, the one that read, "If you refuse to comply with this request, we will have no choice but to involve law enforcement." I couldn't believe what I was reading. The HOA was threatening to involve the police over a statue. This was no longer about property rights or neighborhood aesthetics. This was about control. They wanted to break me, to force me into submission through intimidation and fear. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. If they thought I was going to back down because of a letter filled with empty threats, they were sorely mistaken. I decided it was time to take the next step. I called Lisa again, explained the latest development, and asked her what our next move should be. She was firm in her response. We're not going to let them get away with this. It's time to take this to court if they continue down this path. We'll make sure they understand that they cannot use their power to trample on your rights. Her confidence was contagious, and I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't going to let the HOA control my life any longer. This was my home, my property, and no one, not the HOA, not anyone, was going to tell me what I could or couldn't do with it. The following days brought a sense of mounting anticipation and unease, the air thick with the promise of an impending showdown. I spent hours preparing, getting everything in place to make sure that if it came to a legal battle, I would be ready. I double-checked all the documentation, reread the HOA's violation notices, and made sure I had a full understanding of my rights as a homeowner. But deep down, there was a part of me that dreaded what was coming. No one wanted to go to court. No one wanted to turn their personal space into a battleground. But as much as I hated to admit it, this was no longer about just a statue. This had become a matter of principle. The HOA's refusal to acknowledge my rights as a homeowner, their desire to impose their will over a harmless piece of art, had made this a fight I couldn't afford to lose. The days seemed to blur together as the anticipation built. Each day, more cars passed by, more eyes turned my way. It felt like I was becoming a spectacle, the whole neighborhood watching, waiting to see what I would do. The tension in the air was suffocating, and yet I stood firm. I had already sent my cease and desist letter. I had already consulted my lawyer, and now it was only a matter of time before the HOA made their next move. It came sooner than I expected. One afternoon, as I was sitting in my living room, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from my front yard. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't have to look out the window to know who it was. Natalie. The HOA president had arrived with all the authority she thought she could wield. I could hear her voice before I even saw her, sharp and insistent, issuing commands as if she owned the entire block. She was trying to make her presence known, trying to intimidate me into giving up without a fight. But I wasn't going to be intimidated. Not this time. I stood up from my chair and walked toward the door, my hands shaking slightly as I grabbed the handle. The confrontation I had been bracing for was finally here, and as I opened the door, I was met with a sight I had come to dread. Natalie stood there, flanked by two security guards who looked as though they had been instructed to stand by, ready to act. She didn't even look at me directly, her eyes trained on the statue, as if she were expecting it to magically disappear at her command. Her words were as cold as ice. "This statue must come down immediately," she stated, her voice dripping with condescension. "The HOA has made it clear that it's a violation, and we won't tolerate defiance." I felt my pulse quicken as I met her gaze. I wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. I took a deep breath and squared my shoulders, stepping onto the porch to meet her head-on. "I told you before," I said, my voice steady. "This statue is not going anywhere. It's my property, and I have every right to display it as I see fit." The tension between us hung in the air, like a taut rope ready to snap. Natalie's expression tightened, and I could see the anger building behind her calm exterior. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who wasn't afraid of her. The two security guards shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to proceed, clearly out of their element. This wasn't a situation they were trained to handle. It was one thing to escort someone out of a building or enforce rules in a community center. It was another to try and force a homeowner to remove something that wasn't illegal or harmful. But Natalie didn't care. She had made up her mind, and she wasn't going to let something as trivial as legality or reason stand in her way. "You're making a mistake," she warned, her voice low and threatening. "If you don't comply, we will escalate this further. The HOA will not back down." Her words echoed in the space between us, a clear threat that she hoped would break me. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. "I've already told you," I repeated, my voice firm. "I'm not removing the statue. And if you want to escalate this, I'm ready. I'm not going to be intimidated into submission." Natalie's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of doubt pass through her gaze. She wasn't used to people standing up to her. It was clear that this wasn't the outcome she had anticipated. But she wasn't going to walk away without one last attempt to assert her authority. "If you refuse to comply, we'll take legal action," she said, her voice cold with menace. "We'll make sure you pay the price for your defiance." I could feel my anger rising, but I refused to let it control me. "Go ahead," I said. "I'm prepared to go to court if that's what it takes." There was a long silence as Natalie glared at me, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. But slowly, she seemed to deflate, the edge of her authority slipping away as she realized that I wasn't going to budge. With a final glare, she turned and walked back toward her security guards. "You'll regret this," she muttered under her breath, but I could see the defeat in her eyes. She wasn't getting what she wanted, and that was enough to send her back to her car, retreating from the confrontation. As she drove away, I stood there, watching her go, feeling a wave of triumph wash over me. I had stood my ground, and I had won. It wasn't over, of course. The HOA still had the power to take legal action, but for the first time, I felt like I had the upper hand. They couldn't intimidate me into removing something I had every right to keep. It was a small victory, but it was one that I savored. As I watched Natalie's car disappear down the street, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. The battle wasn't won yet, but it was a step in the right direction. And no matter what happened next, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let the HOA take away my right to express myself in my own home.